welcome you back to Exploring a Postmodern Gospel. This session, we're going to take a deep look into the Imago Dei, or the image of God in the person of Jesus. If the root problem is our capacity to construct a false reality that invalidates the self, how does God work to restore that sense of reality? During this sixth session, we will be processing chapters 10, 11, and 12. Please post at least one question or observation regarding these chapters in the discussion boards. Then post a response to at least two other participants' questions or observations. At some point this session, finish reading chapter 13. I also want to encourage you to answer the session question in the discussion boards. Once again, I want to invite you to close your eyes and use your imagination for a moment to step into the God imagination. This is life from God's perspective. God first sees you as good. God began the world by embedding into you a deep sense of worth and value. You were created in God's image. You are a child of God. This is your original identity, and you were called for a deeply meaningful purpose, to rule over yourself. You're called to live into this purpose on a moment-by-moment basis. God has gifted you with a deep sense of freedom because you are not defined by what you do. Circumstance cannot change your value, your identity, or your purpose, but it can affect you. If you lose sight of your value, you will experience a profound sense of pain and suffering that can often feel overwhelming. But when you hold on to that good, which is established by God, you know it to be true because you will experience a deep sense of peace and harmony with yourself and with others. This is your terra firma, your ground of being. This is God's perspective of what is true. Feel free to rest in this reality for a moment. I want to encourage you to post another response in the discussion boards regarding what you experienced. When you are ready, you can always come back to this presentation. I also want to provide a brief review of the human imagination. These patterns are called the way of the world. It's our attempt to get back into the circle. The way of the world works itself out largely as pride, which is our attempt to validate the self through subjective means. But it also shows up as social comparison, relationship, the law, and religion. Religion is deeply important to the story because it reveals the contractual means we agree with God to be satisfied or appeased. Last session, we explored the Missio Dei, or the mission of God. In contrast to the human imagination, which attempts to solve the problem using subjective means, God's response is based upon reality established in the beginning of creation. God isn't creating anything new. God is simply working to restore our capacity to see it. But to do that, God uses the human construct to reveal and solve the problem. This process allows humanity to exhaust the efficacy of the way of the world. The story shifts dramatically at this point. Humanity, represented in the form of Israel, is back in a state of captivity. Israel is literally embedded into the empire, ready to perform its role as priest. And then, almost out of nowhere, arrives this man. Jesus is called the Word made flesh. This distinction is important because it's calling us back to God's original declarations, to God's original perspective of reality. God is now on the move and ready to step into the ultimate test of reality, one that proves the reality of good. Jesus engages God's mission with what is arguably God's mission statement. Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And as we read this, it's important to understand that if this is the moment when God is announcing his displeasure with humanity, if this is the moment when God wants us to know that we've broken God's will and someone needs to be punished, or that humanity is captivated by Satan, this is the time to let everyone know. But instead, Jesus calls out the root problem. There is a sense of captivity, but it's internal, and it produces a state of blindness to reality. Humanity is captive to its own imagination. And the quote finishes with a direct reference to the root problem, which is the perception of favor. Humanity believes it has become invalidated, so the mission directly addresses the root problem. The mission of God was about restoring humanity to God's original reality. It's not about making something true. It's about restoring humanity's capacity to see what is true. Jesus invites people into participating with God in the restoration of all reality. Jesus recognized that the problem worked itself out as a way of living, not just a belief. For Jesus, restoration meant getting the original question right, but also in living that reality out, in experiencing life from God's perspective. So Jesus invites people to leave the way of the world behind. Jesus is not talking about leaving behind old religious practices for new ones. He's talking about leaving behind the lie, which says we need to earn something. The practice of humility directly addressed pride by addressing the root problem. It wasn't about groveling our way back to God. It was about letting go of the need to validate the self. And once we do, we can begin to live consistently with reality. When we let go of trying to get something, we can see we already have it. We also don't like admitting where Jesus is taking us. The footsteps of Jesus always lead us directly to the cross. They lead us to the scene of the crime in our lives, where we can deal with the judgments that are literally crucifying us. Jesus consistently spoke of the kingdom of God, and it's easy to assume that God's kingdom is out there or up there. We see it as someplace removed, but for Jesus, it was here and now. It was present. Why? Because for God, there is no separation. There is only one reality, and it's all good. So the kingdom of God is a way of judging reality. It begins with God's original perspective. It begins with a God imagination. And at the center of God's rule is the judgment of creation, which God has already established. God's perspective doesn't change. Ours does. The problem isn't out there, it's in here, in the heart and mind. Holiness, or wholeness, was not based on our actions. It began with God's original judgment. And if we got that judgment wrong, everything was skewed. Holiness began with getting the original question right again. Jesus presents a simple, clarifying image for humanity. So when we look at Jesus, we see God's judgment. And when we hear the words, "This is my child in whom I am well pleased," these are God's words for us. But it also works the other way. When God looks at us, God sees Jesus. And God actually sees us. But this idea gives us a clarifying image of God's original perspective. We've always been God's children, but we need Jesus to remember how God really feels. Grace was always true, but we just couldn't see it. The root problem created the idea that we can't be children of God if we can produce evil. We begin outside the circle, and before we can even do anything about it, we've already disqualified ourselves. We've blown it before we're even aware of the problem. Jesus revealed a deep connection with God that proved his command over life. He fulfilled the law and the religious commands. He was religiously and legally perfect. He met the demands of the system. And Jesus asked this really intriguing question. He asked, "Who do you say that I am?" And this question presents a strange problem in a religious culture trying to get into or stay in the circle. To admit Jesus is the Son of God is to admit he's inside the circle. So the natural question is then, how did he get inside the circle? Jesus consistently told stories using metaphors regarding fruit. And once again, Jesus is taking us right back to the beginning, to the fruit in the tree. The fruit was the recurring evidence that revealed our internal judgment of reality. When we saw the self as worthless, our lives would continue to reveal fruit that we were worthless. In this way, the problem was self-reinforcing. So over and over again, Jesus gives us a way of seeing the root problem. And it's painful to see the fruit. It's just easier to ignore the evidence in the beginning. But there's only two types of fruit, those that produce death and those that produce life. The fruit was the indicator of the embedded judgment, not kingdom reality. So when our lives consistently revealed pain and suffering, it's trying to tell us something is wrong. The fruit simply revealed the embedded judgment we were holding on to. Jesus then did something so radical for a culture based on the law that it's considered scandalous. Jesus reduced an entire way of living down to the law of love. But what Jesus is doing is not new. Love was simply God's judgment of good. It was going right back to God's original reality. Jesus also revealed that there was no exception to the law. It included everything in reality, including the enemy. For Jesus, there is no one outside the circle because God's perspective never included an exception. And it was deeply important that Jesus went this far. Jesus understood that our problem wasn't some other person who had become the enemy. If we lived by the way of the world, if we lived by the rule of law, we would be consistently reminded that we were failures. The self could and would become the enemy. So when Jesus says, love your enemy, he's likely beginning with the self. Jesus also clarifies how far love would go. Was there some situational ethic that we could construct that said, this is the line, this is the end of love? And for Jesus, there was no end to love. It included the possibility of giving one's life. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And we see this in Jesus' interaction with people. He consistently went against the way of the world. For Jesus, there was no need for comparison. There was no need for pride because each person was already a child of God. Jesus consistently stepped out of bounds regarding class and social status because there was no need for it. He touched and even healed those who had been cursed by God. The religious system assumed that sickness was a direct result of being cursed by God. He hung out with those who broke the law and said, you are still worth it to me. He sought out humility and downward mobility. He was willing to trust his Father with his money, his time, and his care and concerns. Jesus didn't have to get because he already had. His life was based on freedom because he wasn't driven by need. But the mission was always about restoration. It was about setting things right. And to do that, Jesus had to go back to the beginning, to the scene of the crime. And so we see these images show up in a story that call us back to where the problem started. Jesus withers a fig tree, reminding us that the covering could never work. Jesus returns to the garden, reminding us to remember where it all started. Jesus is actually crucified on a tree, reminding us to remember the original question. Everything is about going back to the scene of the crime. I also want to call out something about communion. When Jesus leads his followers into communion, he first gives them a sense of atonement. The communion first represented something for them, and they receive it. It was a reminder of the sacrifice for them. But it's also an invitation into the act of suffering for the other, to love. Jesus invites them to follow into the process of being love, being the priest for those who are suffering, to step into another person's fears and pains and be love for that person. And this would require us to take on suffering ourselves, to sacrifice for the other. The life of Jesus has always been leading up to the one event, the cross. The gospel was always a problem and a solution, and Jesus has finally arrived. Jesus knows his actual purpose to become the ultimate sacrifice for humanity. So the final hours are a descent into fulfilling the religious approval process. Israel is called upon to serve its purpose, which is to act as a priest for the empire. They must scrutinize Jesus to make sure he is without flaw. This is their role, to serve up the sacrifice, and Jesus is declared without flaw. The purpose of this act goes back to the religious contract. Humanity needs a substitute, so God gives them one. But the purpose of the atonement is for humanity. It gives them the evidence they need that love is actually true. So we have to ask, who is making the demands for a substitute in the story? We have to ask, who is making the ransom demands for release? When we read the story, it is painfully clear. We are. The atonement isn't for God demanding the death of his own son to be appeased. It's not to release us from Satan's captivity. Satan isn't even there. The roar of the crowd reveals who is making the demands. We are. When we see the problem God is solving, the cross becomes an ultimate test of reality. How far is God really willing to go to prove the reality of love? Is there something humanity can do to make God say, yep, that's it. I just can't go that far? Humanity literally kills the God image in its presence, and God doesn't give up. This is arguably the deepest act of evil, to attempt to kill the presence of God, and God still won't give up. The cross is then Jesus lifting up his arms and saying, this is how far I will go to show you reality. This is how far I will go to prove the reality of good, that I love you. And there is nothing you can do to change that. In the face of your worst, I will reveal my best. And we can't ignore Paul's words. Jesus becomes sin. If we frame this as an act, as though sin is something we do, like stealing, we miss the deeper meaning of what is going on. Sin was first about losing sight of reality. And for a brief moment on the cross, we see Jesus lose touch with reality. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" For a brief moment, his Father becomes just God. And the purpose is not to enter into sin to show us that it's cool, but to show us that it doesn't define us, that it can't define us. This is how far Jesus was willing to go to show us the way out. Jesus steps into that reality of separation to show us the way through. The purpose is to overcome sin, not to glorify it. And then the story gives us one of the richest images that once again takes us back to the beginning. The temple curtain rips apart, not from the bottom up, which would signify humanity tearing it apart, but from the top down, which is signifying God tearing it apart. The curtain tearing doesn't make it true. It reveals what has always been true. God has always been there. God has always been present. But now the human contract has been fulfilled. The greatest act of love the world has ever known has now proven the reality of love. For the first moment in history, we see the other side of the cross. The contract has been fulfilled. But now we can begin to live life in light of the new evidence. Life becomes possible because we have an entirely different picture of God. God restores humanity's dignity, identity, and purpose through Jesus. But the story doesn't end there. There's still this little problem called death. Death was both spiritual or perceptual and physical. Humanity still could wonder what happens after we die, so God addresses that too. Jesus proves a command over both life and death. Jesus is resurrected in the flesh and reveals himself to his disciples. Jesus reveals that physical death is not the end of everything. God's answer is good news because it is so complete. It fundamentally addresses the root problem in humanity. It proves the reality of love in a way that restores everything. It allows us to see everything from God's perspective. We didn't have to judge. God had already done it for us. But if we judged, we could look at life through the cross, this undeniable evidence in the story. When we change our understanding of the problem, we change our understanding of the gospel. But when we do, we allow it to be what it really is, which is good news. I want to end this presentation with a story and a final question. The image of the cross is troubling because this is where Jesus' invitation to follow leads. But it's not our final destination. It's a way station to engage our restoration. Some years ago, I was on a retreat with some friends who were practicing what it meant to follow Jesus. And a friend of mine, who I will call Peter, said he saw Jesus. He said it was an actual appearance, and from the reaction he got, I really believed him. He was in a serious daze and couldn't really talk for about half a day. His hands were shaking, and it was like he had just seen something he didn't think he was supposed to see. I knew he wasn't making it up because my friend would never have suggested Jesus do what he did. As part of the treat, we were on an assignment to take a walk alone. It was a beautiful sunny morning, and we were situated in a remarkably beautiful village of cabins and homes in the mountains. 100-foot pines surrounded the streets in the small rural neighborhood. The purpose of the walk was simply to take in the beauty and have a conversation with God about what we had experienced during the weekend. Many of the guys were seriously wrestling with what it meant to actually take the first step towards following Jesus. It's the step where we move beyond the words and into action, into trust. The assignment was supposed to last for 30 minutes, and as guys filled back in, Peter was noticeably absent. We were supposed to participate in an extended period of reflection and worship, and then share what happened on our walk. But as time extended past the 30 minutes, Peter didn't show up. We hesitated to start, wanting everyone to participate, but something inside of me said he needed to be alone, so we started. As worship continued, two of the guys didn't like the idea that the whole group wasn't there, so they went to look for him. It was entirely possible that he had gotten lost, given the maze of streets. When they found him, he was in a daze. He had a huge smile on his face, but he was shaking, almost unable to handle his thoughts. He varied between wanting to cry and wanting to let what happened to him sink in. We sat down in the living room of the cabin, and he shared his story with us. He was walking in a remote area away from the cabin, and when he turned around, there was Jesus 15 feet away. At first, he didn't know what to do, but he felt an amazing sense of peace. He didn't want to do anything that would somehow change the moment, so he just stood there. Peter started to cry as he recounted the story. He was wrestling with a deep sense of unworthiness. Why would Jesus visit him? He asked. And then Peter said, I asked him to walk with me, but he wouldn't. You could see the deep fear and confusion on Peter's face. He couldn't understand why Jesus was there and why he wouldn't walk with him. So he asked again, walk with me. At this point, he started to cry. He tried to convince us and himself that what he saw was real. He kept waiting for that moment that Jesus would somehow magically disappear, leaving him to wonder if the experience were real or not. He asked a third time, please walk with me. The confusion on his face as he recounted the story was mixed with hope. He wasn't willing to give up, even though Jesus wouldn't respond the way he wanted him to. He kept saying over and over again, I just didn't understand why he wouldn't walk with me. I knew some of Peter's life story. We had had many conversations about his past, and I knew he was assuming that God was somehow rejecting him. But Jesus had a deeper purpose in his denial of Peter's request. I asked Peter, do you really want God to follow you, or is he inviting you to follow him? Peter dropped his head. The message had found its recipient. Jesus was inviting Peter to let go of control. He was inviting him to follow, not to lead. And this is the exhilarating tension of the journey. We're not used to following. We're not used to being in the spaces that feel out of control. We've spent most of our life in the driver's seat, giving it our best shot, the best we can. Isn't this what the world and life has taught us, to become masters of our own fate? The invitation to follow is not just an invitation to step out of control, but to discover our original purpose, which is self-control. It's an invitation to freedom. It's an invitation to discover our identity as children of the living God, our original identity. And most importantly, it's an opportunity to answer the original question once and for all. To do that, we have to take a leap of faith and step back into relationship with the God who has designed us. But to engage that invitation means letting go of the lie we've been holding on to. So the journey always leads us back to the scene of the crime. It leads us back to the moment when we got it wrong, when we judged the self in a way that was crippling to the soul. But it also leads us to the cross, to the moment where we can begin to let go of the very thing that imprisons us, which is our false judgment that we need to let go. Forgiveness is already there, waiting to be found, if we're willing to look. And when we do, we can begin to discover the other side of the cross, the side that produces life, the side that reveals we can overcome. As we draw to a close, I want to once again bring this down to real life. Over the last 5 sessions, we've been processing what it means to overcome and to step into our own restoration. And we do this by letting go of the false judgments, the ones that imprison us outside of the kingdom of God. They're the judgments that see us as unworthy, not good enough, and just not quite there yet. They're the ones that invalidate us in ways that are oppressive. The question I want to leave you with is, what does the story of redemption look like for my event? As you begin to work through the process of redemption, I want to invite you to begin actively dreaming of what it would look like to let the judgment go. Give yourself permission to set it down at the cross. I want to end this presentation here so we can begin having a conversation about it in the discussion boards. Once again, much love to each of you, and I look forward to our conversation about the gospel.